Today, I'm going to tell you a story written right here about a man named John. And this story about John will highlight and give you insight into why the current job market is quite possibly the worst time in history to lose your job, even though the unemployment rate appears low at 3.7%. Now, the reasons behind this are not just tied to the job market. And in order to get the full picture, we're going to have to go over various parts of the economy as a whole. So, pay attention to how they all tie together to create the perfect disaster waiting to happen for John and for many other Americans in 2024. Okay, let's start this story. Now, John is a blue-collar worker working in shipping in a warehouse for one of the largest companies on the planet. But don't be fooled, John is a hard worker and he's smart. He had multiple opportunities to go to college, getting good grades throughout high school. But instead, he chose to begin work immediately after high school due to a tumultuous relationship with his parents. Simply put, his dad was a hard ass. He loved his son John, but he was a hard ass, and John just wanted his own place and his own money. Now, that was almost 20 years ago, as John is 38 years old now, and over his current 20-year career, his hard work and his just get-it-done attitude has brought him very far. He is now middle management in charge of his own department at one of the largest warehouses in his city. And while the current median household income is around $74,000, John actually makes about $70,000 by himself. And with the help of his wife, who works part-time because they have 3 kids at home, they pull in close to $100,000, well above the median. With that said, moving out so young came with freedom, and that freedom came with children. But John was loyal. Even though his dad seemed like a pain in his ass, he taught him right. So John stayed through it all with his then girlfriend, now wife, when their first child came 15 years ago. A second child came 5 years after that, and a third child came 5 years after that. So while John and his wife, Cindy by the way, make good money, they also have 3 more mouths to feed, 3 kids to eventually put through college, 3 kids to buy clothes for, and the list goes on. So while John's family makes good money, it still seems to be stretched thin every single month. And that definitely stresses John out, although he usually tries to keep it lighthearted with himself and chuckles at the thought that 20 years ago, when he started his career, hell, even 10 years ago, making $100,000 would have made him feel rich. Now, he wonders though if he's even middle class. And he's not alone in that feeling. A lot of data now puts the middle class at $120,000, which is $50,000 than just a few years ago when it was about 70 grand. And Gen Z, for example, does not consider $74,000 middle class, even though technically it's literally the median income. But I digress. For John, who's had 3 kids for the last 5 years, money has always needed to be budgeted. But it's really over the last 3 years or so that it just seems to be going a smaller and smaller distance. And really over the last year and a half, John has noticed more and more months where he has had to draw from his savings to make ends meet. So much so that John has seen his savings go from $48,000, which was getting very close to the average savings balance of around $65,000, which remember is skewed by very high earners, to now around $10,000, which is much closer to the median savings balance, which is not skewed as much by high earners and thus is much more reflective of the average American. This, of course, is super scary for John, who's seen that change take place in just the last 24 months. The first few months, he didn't really think much of it because we were in the middle of lockdowns, economic shutdowns. John even at one point was furloughed, but was promised by upper management that it was temporary, and it was, although it lasted a little bit longer than expected. Regardless, obviously, at the beginning, times were going to be tougher a couple years ago when the economy was going through so much. So he didn't really get too concerned then. But now, he wondered how their monthly budget was still outpacing their income by $1,000 every single month, 2 years after that whole mess. Really more like 3 years. Well, inflation. Prices on average have increased a whopping 20% just since 2020. Which means, for example, if a family had a $5,000 monthly expenses, that would now be close to $6,000 in monthly expenses for the same stuff. And that is basically what happened to John. A once net positive budget was now a net negative budget, and to be honest, if this lasted much longer, they would have to start relying more and more on credit cards just to cover basic family necessities. And that's something that's already happening to a huge swath of Americans. Recent data shows that about 48% of Americans depend exactly on their credit cards to cover essential living expenses. And not to get sidetracked too much, but this is one of the reasons why we have increasing credit card debt and why it's so different this time around. It's not fancy purchases anymore. It's living expenses that are driving up credit card debt. And that credit card debt, it just hit an all-time high of over $1 trillion. Now that's scary, especially when less and less of that credit card debt can be written off as just bad financial habits, and more can be tied directly just to the cost of living. It's just people trying to get by. Now, luckily for John, he wasn't there yet, but he was close. He had seen his savings drop $30,000 in just the last 2 years. And he also noticed something else. 2 months ago, his wife Cindy's car broke down, transmission issue, out of warranty. And a couple years ago, that really wouldn't have been a big issue, because that's what savings are for, right? But this time around, the last $10,000 of John's savings were sitting in a high-yield bank CD, which means that there would be penalties for pulling that money, which means that for the first time in 10 years, John and his wife had to rely on a credit card to cover an emergency expense. This is something that is also happening to more and more Americans. Recent data shows that 43% of Americans with credit card debt say it is due precisely to emergency expenses. So, what does this mean? It means that while, yes, the unemployment rate is very low at 3.7%, the real question is, are those jobs paying livable wages? Or are they just paying just enough to make employment worth it, just enough to stop some bleeding for most of Americans' wallets? Now, all of this was obviously very stressful for John, but at least they weren't at risk of being out on the streets tomorrow. At least not yet. One looming thought, though, seemed to grow bigger and bigger in the back of John's mind, and that was how f***ed he'd be if he lost his job. Just 24 months ago, he, in a sense, did lose his job. He was furloughed. And while annoying back then, it didn't really worry him too much, because he had strong savings and untouched credit limits, and his wife, who was working part-time, was still able to continue to work. Now, though, with bills that outpaced his combined income and savings that were dwindled, and seeing in real time how he had to rely on a credit card for the first time in 10 years, the thought of him losing his job made him shudder. If he lost his job, his wife's income would barely cover their mortgage, which means in that scenario, savings again would have to be used for all living expenses. Savings that they really didn't have anymore. Now, let's talk about that mortgage here for a second. 5 years ago, John and Cindy had their third kid, and 2 years ago, they had had enough of trying to fit 5 people in their small 2-bedroom house that they had lived in since they got married. So they decided to buy a house in mid-2022. And as I'm sure we all remember, interest rates were and still are very high, and housing prices were and still are very high. No big deal, their lender at the time told them. Just do a 2-1 buy down. You guys remember 2-1 buy downs? They were super popular just a couple of years ago, and we'll talk about those here in a second. Anyways, just do a 2-1 buy down, and when interest rates inevitably come down, you can refinance, the lender said. And that's exactly what they did. They bought a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house twice as big as their old one for their growing family. And now, almost 2 years later, that decision was starting to show its ugly head and add more and more stress to John and his family. And that's because the 2-1 buy down that he had got was about to expire. And guess what? interest rates weren't really looking any better, which means that in just a few months, when that 2-1 buy down ends, their mortgage payment is going to go up. Again, stretching their already negative budget and upping the stakes even more if John lost his job. Well, you're probably wondering, why is John even worrying about losing his job in the first place? Isn't that just borrowing trouble? Well, yes, in most instances. But John wasn't stupid, and he was well aware of the events taking place around him. For the last year and a half, there had been talk about a recession that never really came technically, although to him and many other Americans, it sure felt like one already. And on top of that, John did know that the longer the economy remained in a high interest rate environment, the higher the chance of recession eventually showing up. And John, being middle management, had just enough inside knowledge to know what was going on in his own company. But also, John, being middle management, was unfortunately not high enough up the ladder to be immune from layoffs. And with this whole new artificial intelligence thing, John had seen firsthand how jobs at his very own company had been merged and then assisted with AI. And the final kicker, last meeting, he had overheard his boss on the phone with corporate talking about how departments could probably be combined, eliminating the need from anywhere from 25 to 30% of middle management at each warehouse. And he had heard his name mentioned. Unfortunately, he didn't catch the entire conversation, and he was unsure if his name was mentioned in the keep him side or the he's disposable side. Now, so far, with everything we've discussed, I'm sure you can see how detrimental losing a job would be for someone in John's situation. And that's before we even begin to talk about the job market itself. Here's the thing though, John's situation is not unique. It's a situation that's currently being faced by millions of Americans as we speak. A recent survey found that half of Americans would run out of money within 1 month if they lost their source of income. And a whopping 29% would run out of money in less than 1 week. Now, luckily, John was doing better than that, but even him and his family realistically would be out of money within a few months if that unfortunate moment came. And that exact thought is what stressed John out. That exact thought is what kept John awake at night. And unfortunately for John, or fortunately, depending on which lens you look through, the knowledge is power lens or the ignorance is bliss lens, little did he know the changes that were taking place in the job market as 2023 progressed into 2024. And those changes have been felt by many, even though we seem to be in a low unemployment environment. Plain and simple, getting hired now if you're unemployed is harder than it's been in a long time. In fact, on average, for every 30 applications, an individual can expect roughly only 4 calls back. Now, of course, if you send more applications, you'll get more callbacks, but that is still an abysmal 13% callback rate. And that is before the hiring process really even begins, before video calls, before in-person interviews, and nowadays, multiple round interviews are becoming more and more common. So the actual hiring rate is a fraction of that 13% callback rate. And what makes this even more interesting is how the unemployment data looks strong, but the actual sentiment, even from hiring experts, paints a different picture. For example, recruiter and job market expert Brian Creeley highlighted the overall sentiment in one of his posts, and I quote, "It's not normal to compete with 2,000 other candidates for a crappy job. It's not normal to go through 7 rounds of interviews only to get ghosted. It's not normal to get laid off 1 month after getting promoted. It's not normal to be shamed for refusing to work for free to prove yourself. It's not normal to have your offer rescinded the day before you start. It's not normal to have only 24 hours to return to the office or get fired. It's not you, it's them." For John and for millions of other Americans who are quite literally one financial misstep, one emergency expense away from disaster, That is the job market that awaits them should they be unfortunate enough to lose their job. Should you be unfortunate enough to lose your job? Did you know that most Americans cannot afford a $400 surprise expense? That is just the reality of the current economic situation for most people. And on top of that, here's the final nail in the coffin that truly makes this one of the most dangerous times to lose your job. And it's that this is only going to get worse before it gets better. And that's simply because of those high interest rates that we talked about earlier. The longer the economy remains in a high interest rate environment, the higher the odds of recession. That's basic economics. And even if recession does not truly occur, companies are going to get more and more picky about who they hire the longer they go without the cheap money they were accustomed to in order to grow. And so far in 2024, it's only looking like it will be further, not sooner, that we will get low interest rates. The last inflation report, for example, came in pretty bad, at least in regards to the Fed's cutting rates. And the odds of rate cuts have actually gone down dramatically because of that, with the odds of a rate cut by March going from above 75% to less than 10%. In simple terms, this just means we will live with higher rates for longer. And the job market will continue to tighten as 2024 progresses precisely because of that fact. What does this mean for John and for the rest of our fellow Americans? It means that not only is losing a job extra risky right now because of how expensive everything is, because of how underpaid a lot of people are, because of how little savings most Americans have, and because of how picky employers are at hiring right now, but also because that dangerous situation is not going away anytime soon. So, will John get fired? Will John lose the only thing that is keeping him and his family afloat? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. 20 years ago, when John moved out, I don't think he could have imagined a time where $100,000 per year, a loving wife, 3 beautiful kids, and a brand new home for his growing family would feel so fleeting, so unstable, and so uncertain. Like one financial mistake, one layoff could make all of that disappear. Just 3 short years ago, instead, it probably would have felt like a dream come true.